Hi there, and welcome back to the channel. Swift concurrency is something that I love talking about. If you're subscribed to this channel, you would know. If you're not subscribed, change that right now so you can see just how much I like to make videos about Swift concurrency. One of the new things that Apple added in Swift 6 relates to sendability, and it's called the sending keyword. So I thought I'd record this video and take a moment to show you exactly what the sending keyword is and how it relates to sendable closures. Because if you've been keeping up with Swift concurrency or you tried migrating to Swift 6, you might have noticed that sometimes you run into errors related to sending something to a sendable closure where it's not allowed. What that means in a nutshell, and we'll show that in code as well, is that you're trying to pass something that is not safe to be used concurrently into a place where concurrent use might happen. So for example, you might be making a class that has a number in there, like a counter, and you're trying to mutate that counter from inside of a task. And Swift concurrency in 5 point whatever it was could tell you that this was not allowed because you're trying to pass this non-sendable counting object that can be mutated into a task, which needs a sendable closure. And if you have multiple of these tasks running at the same time, and they all try to mutate that object at the same time, you would have a crash. And so you'd have a data race. And as a result, you would always have to make sure that whatever you're passing into these sendable closures was safe to be mutated from multiple tasks. There are cases where the compiler can actually see that you're creating an instance of an object, you're passing it into this sendable closure, and you're never using it again. And that should be safe. And it wasn't until Swift 6 that Apple started really adding features like region-based isolation, and in this case, the sending keyword. Enough trying to explain it through words. Let's go ahead and look at some code because that will make things much, much clearer. Okay, so what we have here is my little example playground. The code that's currently on screen compiles exactly as we want it to. Now, I'm going to go on ahead and not use sending here and actually use sendable first, because the code right now in the current example uses sendable, and we of course don't want that because we want to see what sendable closures were like so that we can see how sending solves a problem for us. So if in this code I have my model object, which has a counter variable that I can increment wherever I want, I create an object right here inside of my function, and then I have this sendable closure. In Swift 5.9 and 5.10, tasks, for example, or continuations or task groups would all take sendable closures. They don't anymore, but they used to. And if you're still using Xcode 15, you would see errors around this. You would see the error that we're about to see. If you're using Xcode 16, you won't see this error, and I'll explain why in a second. So if we take a look at this error, you might have seen it. Capture of object with non-sendable type model object in a sendable closure. This is essentially telling me that this closure right here is expecting to only capture state that is sendable. So that means that this closure should be safe to execute concurrently or from multiple tasks. Of course, it's not safe to do that because this closure captures that model object, which is not sendable. Tasks used to do this, but currently, if we take a look at how task is defined in Swift concurrency, we'll see that task actually has an initializer that takes a sending closure. So if we actually jump in here, we're getting to actor. That's not what I want. I want task. Maybe it's in the documentation. We'll try that. There we go. This right here. Operation sending, escaping, isolated any, async success. A lot of stuff going on. None of that we're really particularly interested in right now, except for sending. This used to be at sendable in Swift 5.9, but in Swift 6 it is sending. So why are we only seeing this error in Xcode 15 and not in 16, regardless of our language mode? That's because this change has been made to the Swift 6 compiler regardless of your language mode, when you're using the Swift 5 language mode, you're not actually using Swift 5, you're using the Swift 6 compiler with Swift 5 language mode. Very long story short, task now takes a sending closure because it solves issues related to this exact compiler error that we're seeing right here. And that's because this code is perfectly safe. We make an instance of my model object, I pass it into this closure, and I never use it again. So even though right here it is complaining that we're not sendable and we might have data races as a result, we know that we cannot ever have data races. So if instead of a sendable closure, I use a sending closure, we're currently fine. And that's because sending allows us to say, well, this closure that we're passing here is allowed to capture non-sendable state, but under one condition. After we transfer this object, my model object, into this sending closure, we're not allowed to use it again. So for example, if I try to increment the counter right here, we're going to have a compiler error again, saying value of non-sendable type. We don't really care about that. It should be a lot cleaner in my opinion, but in any case, accessed after being transferred, later access could raise. Access can happen concurrently. So that's telling us that we're capturing and accessing something that we're also accessing outside of this closure. Right, so we're not allowed to do that. The compiler is also able to see that we might mutate before passing it, and then we're fine. If we try and pass this same object to a task, which also takes a sending closure, we're actually going to have the same problem. Right, because now, oh, hold on, let's actually fix that real quick. Platforms, macOS v15. There we go. The build fails with error. Right, we're getting the same error again because we're transferring this into a sending closure and then we're trying to do that again. So this is really nice because this allows us to have safe transfer from one place to the next, where we would expect something to be sendable or at least safe to run concurrently, but maybe the object that we're transferring isn't sendable, so a sendable closure wouldn't work. So Apple actually changed task. They changed the continuation APIs, so things like with checked continuation will now actually take a sending closure instead of sendable. With task group is now also a sending closure instead of a sendable closure. That's really convenient because that means that we're able to do things like what we can do right here. It's actually all smart enough to notice that this, for example, also would not be safe. In this case, we're creating an instance of my model object outside of the function, and then we're passing everything into sending closure. Initially, this is going to say that we are trying to capture self, which is accessible to code in the current task. In other words, wherever we are calling try sending from has access to our current instance of sending sample, which means that it could be doing other things to it as well, and that is not safe. If we make sure that we don't capture self, but only captured its object, it's going to tell us the same error, except object is accessible in the current task, and the compiler cannot prove that we're not doing anything silly with the object. So this is really only usable for very local instances of non-sendable state that you want to pass into a sending closure. You also have functions with sending arguments. The rules for those are pretty much the same, right? When you pass something that's not sendable into a function that takes a sending argument, you're not allowed to use that object after calling the function. Really convenient API that allows us to write code more naturally. And if you migrated to Swift 6 or strict concurrency in the early times, you probably ran into this a lot and you had to devise some workarounds for that. And currently you don't have to do that anymore because we now have sending. So in this video, you learned a lot about how we deal with closures in Swift concurrency. You saw sendable, how that expects everything that we capture to be safe and sendable. And you saw sending on a closure, which allowed us to capture non-sendable state if we don't use that state after we first transfer it into that closure. Sending is really convenient. I don't use it a lot. I find that when I want to incorporate that into my code base, I'll usually only do it when the compiler kind of guides me towards it. It starts complaining about things not being sendable or things not being allowed to transfer from one isolation context to the other. And then I realize that, okay, I do want to transfer this, but I only want to do it once. And so I'll make something sending. If you're writing APIs of your own that take sendable closures, it is very likely that what you're really intending to do is to use sending closures. So I highly recommend that if you have code that uses @sendable on your closures, that you try and change that to be sending instead. For most cases, that should be exactly what you want. Everything should still compile just fine. And workarounds that you had to do to make those sendable closures work can actually be removed. So your code should be a little bit simpler after that. If you enjoyed this video and you want to learn more about Swift's concurrency development for Apple platforms, make sure to follow, make sure to subscribe, make sure that you like and everything else. And then I will see you again in the next video. Thanks for watching.